Imagine holding a small glass vial containing a tiny fragment of bone or a lock of hair that has been tucked away in a museum archive for over 160 years. To the naked eye, it looks like a simple relic of a conflict that defined the 19th century. No, inside those cells is a biological code that has been waiting over a century and a half to be read. For decades, we have relied on yellowed paper records, handwritten muster rolls, and family Bibles to reconstruct the stories of the men who stood on the battlefields of the Civil War. But history books are written by people, and people make mistakes. Sometimes, they even tell lies. Recently, a massive project involving DNA testing on over 500 individuals identified as Confederate soldiers has sent shockwaves through the academic world and left genealogy forums absolutely stunned. They weren't looking for gold or silver. They were looking for the truth buried in the double helix of our ancestors. And what they found didn't just add a footnote to American history. It effectively picked up the pen and began rewriting the entire narrative of who these people were and where they actually came from. For a long time, the image of the Confederate soldier was a very specific one. In the popular imagination, and in the genealogies passed down through generations, these were men of purely Western European descent. Scots-Irish, English, and perhaps a bit of German. This was the story the South told itself for a century. It was a story of a homogeneous group of people unified by a singular heritage. But when modern genomic sequencing met the remains of 500 soldiers from various burial sites across the Southeast, that polished image began to crack. The results revealed a vibrant, complex, and sometimes controversial tapestry of migration and blending that had been hidden by 100 years of social pressure and erased records. One of the most immediate shocks for the genealogy community was the discovery of significant Sephardic Jewish markers in a large percentage of soldiers who were previously thought to be of Anglo-Saxon origin. Now, we know there was a Jewish population in the South during the 1800s, but the DNA suggests a much deeper and more widespread integration than anyone had guessed. We are talking about families who had been in the Americas for generations, who had modified their names and integrated into rural southern communities so thoroughly that their descendants had no idea of their Iberian roots. When the DNA profiles were uploaded to public databases, people who had spent decades proudly tracing their lineage back to a specific village in England suddenly found their charts lighting up with markers from Portugal, Spain, and North Africa. But that was just the beginning. The most transformative part of this study involves the identification of deep ancestry belonging to Native American and North African populations within the Confederate ranks. For over a century, the history of the Civil War was presented in black and white. You were either on one side of a very clear line or the other. But DNA doesn't care about social lines. Among these 500 soldiers, a significant number carried mitochondrial DNA that traces back to indigenous groups of the Southeast, the Cherokee, Choctaw, and Creek nations. This tells us that the frontier wasn't just a place where different groups fought. It was a place where they merged. These soldiers were the products of a melting pot that history books had spent 100 years trying to ignore. In the genealogy forums, the reaction was a mix of disbelief and fascination. Imagine being a 70-year-old researcher who has spent 40 years believing your great-great-grandfather was a pure-blooded Irishman, only to find out through a forensic DNA match that his mother was actually from an indigenous community in the Carolinas. This isn't just a minor detail. It changes your entire understanding of your family's place in the world. It changes your understanding of the social dynamics of the 1860s. It proves that the Southern identity was far more diverse and complex than the traditional narrative ever allowed for. The researchers behind this project used a technique called SNP analysis, which looks at hundreds of thousands of individual points across the genome. This allowed them to bypass the noise of modern contamination and focus on the ancient markers that define a population. What they saw was a story of migration that spanned the globe. They found links to the Canary Islands, to the Ottoman Empire, and to the diverse tribes of the West African coast. Yes, you heard that right. Among these 500 soldiers, several individuals who were listed in the archives as white actually possessed significant percentages of sub-Saharan African heritage. This is where the history starts to get really interesting. In the mid-19th century, there was a concept known as passing. For individuals with mixed heritage, moving into a community where no one knew their family history allowed them to reinvent themselves. They would register as white on the census, join the local militia, and fight for the side they had integrated into. The DNA tests show that this was not a rare occurrence. It was a survival strategy and a social reality for thousands of people. By testing these 500 soldiers, the researchers essentially peer-reviewed the census records of 1860, and they found that the census was often wrong. This discovery has sparked a massive debate about the nature of identity. If a man lived his life as a Confederate soldier, was buried under a stone with a Southern Cross, and told his children he was of English descent, but his DNA says he was 40% North African, what is he? Geography says one thing, politics say another, but the blood says the truth. For genealogists, this is the ultimate puzzle. They are now going back to those old records, looking at the names and locations with fresh eyes. They are finding that the mysterious gaps in a family tree, that grandmother who came from nowhere or the cousin who never spoke of his parents, were often the points where these diverse threads were woven into the tapestry. The technology used in this study is part of a new wave of paleogenomics. This isn't the same kind of test you buy online to see if you have a propensity for cilantro tasting like soap. These are high-depth sequences that can determine the exact geographic origin of a person's ancestors to within a 50-mile radius in many cases. When they applied this to the 500 soldiers, they realized that the Southern identity was actually a massive collection of refugees and migrants from all over the world. They found people who were fleeing the Irish potato famine side by side with people whose families had been in Florida since it was a Spanish colony. One of the most stunned groups in the genealogy community were those who focus on the pioneer families. They found that many of the families who lead the westward expansion into the Deep South were actually part of a group we now call the Melungeons. These were people of triracial descent, European, African, and Native American, who formed self-contained communities in the Appalachian Mountains. For a long time, the origin of the Melungeons was a mythic mystery. Some said they were lost Phoenicians. Others said they were the descendants of shipwrecked Portuguese sailors. The DNA tests on these 500 soldiers, many of whom came from those Appalachian regiments, finally provided the answer. They were the original multicultural Americans, and they were much more prevalent in the military ranks than anyone had previously documented. This project also shed light on the physical health and lives of these men. By analyzing the DNA for certain markers, scientists could see which soldiers carried predispositions for certain diseases and how those conditions might have affected their time in the field. They found evidence of ancient genetic conditions that were common in the Mediterranean, further proving the migration links they had uncovered. This gives us a picture of the soldiers as human beings, not just figures in a history book. We can see their struggles, their health, and their genetic legacy that still lives on in millions of Americans today. The impact on genealogy forums like Ancestry and 23andMe has been massive. Thousands of users are now requesting that their own data be re-evaluated using the specific reference panels developed during this Confederate DNA study. They want to know if they too are part of this rewritten history. The southern section of these forums has become a hotbed of discovery, with people post-dating their family trees and realizing that their ancestors were far more adventurous than they ever imagined. The idea of a pure lineage is dissolving, replaced by a much more accurate and much more interesting story of human movement and adaptation. But why was this hidden for so long? Why did it take over 150 years to learn this? The answer lies in the way history was managed after the war. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, there was a strong push to create a heroic, unified Southern identity. This movement, often referred to as the Lost Cause, sought to simplify the narrative. Part of that simplification involved erasing any evidence of diverse heritage. The records were cleaned, the stories were corrected, and the families who knew the truth whispered it to their children until it eventually became a forgotten secret. The DNA didn't reveal a secret as much as it recovered a memory that had been intentionally suppressed. The researchers also found that many of these soldiers had genetic ties to the Old World that were much more recent than the records suggested. They found first-generation immigrants from places like Italy, Poland, and Greece, who had literally stepped off a boat and found themselves in a uniform within weeks. These men often changed their names to sound more local, making them nearly impossible to trace through traditional paperwork. But the DNA doesn't lie. It showed that the fighting force was a polyglot of languages and backgrounds, all brought together by the chaos of the time. As the data from the 500 soldiers was compared to modern populations, another shocking realization came to light. The genetic legacy of these men is incredibly widespread. Millions of people living in the North and West today, people who may have never stepped foot in the South, actually carry the DNA of these specific soldiers. The internal migration after the war was far more extensive than historians realized. The southern genome moved into the Midwest, into California, and into the Pacific Northwest, blending into the American population until the specific markers of that heritage were lost to time. Until now, in the world of genealogy, breaking down brick walls is the ultimate goal. A brick wall is when you reach a point in your research where the records simply stop. Maybe a courthouse burned down, or maybe the records were never kept. For thousands of researchers, this DNA study acted like a wrecking ball for those walls. By providing a clear biological map of 500 men from various regions, the scientists created a Rosetta Stone for Southern genealogy. If you could match your DNA to one of these 500, you suddenly had a bridge over the gap in your paperwork. The study has also had a profound impact on Native American families who have spent generations trying to prove their ancestors were in specific locations during the 1800s. The DNA evidence from the soldiers confirms the presence of indigenous people in areas and in roles that were previously denied by official government records. It provides a level of validation that paper cannot offer. It's a biological witness to the presence and the participation of the original inhabitants of the land in every aspect of its history. The genealogy forums have seen a surge in DNA matches between people of wildly different backgrounds who can now trace their common ancestor back to one of these soldiers or their families. You might have a suburban family in Ohio and a family in a rural village in Mexico who find out they are third cousins because their shared ancestor was a soldier in an Alabama regiment whose heritage was much more complex than his name suggested. These matches are breaking down social barriers and forcing people to reconsider their own identities in a much broader, more global context. One of the most interesting specific cases in the study involved a soldier known in the records as Private Miller. For a century, his descendants believed he was of German descent. When his DNA was sequenced, it was revealed that he had 0 German markers. Instead, his ancestry was almost entirely West Asian and North African. Further research into his family's specific location revealed that they were part of a small, forgotten community of individuals who had migrated from the outskirts of the Ottoman Empire to the Georgia coast in the late 1700s. They had become Miller to fit in, and they had done it so well that even their own grandchildren didn't know the truth. This is the beauty of the DNA revolution. It is democratic. It doesn't matter how much money you had or how important you were. Your cells recorded the journey of your ancestors regardless of your social status. By testing these 500 soldiers, we are given a voice to the hundreds of thousands of people who were overlooked by the historians who wanted a simpler story. We are seeing the real America. Messy, diverse, and incredibly resilient. The researchers emphasize that this isn't about politics. It's about accuracy. History is a moving target, and as our tools get better, our understanding must evolve. The Confederate DNA Project is now looking to expand its sample size to 2,000. They want to map every single regiment and every single county. Imagine a future where you can click on a map of the 1864 battlefield and see the genetic heat map of the people who were there. It would show a world in motion. A world where the lines of race and origin were already beginning to blur, even as the country was tearing itself apart. In the forums, people are sharing stories of shaking the tree and having the truth fall out. They are finding that their family heritage is a source of pride, not because it is pure, but because it is a story of survival and adaptation. They are proud of the ancestors who crossed oceans, who merged cultures, and who managed to build a life in a new world, even if they had to hide their past to do it. The DNA study has given these families their full story back. It has filled in the colors on a black and white photo. The project has also utilized a specialized type of testing called Y-DNA and mtDNA. For those who aren't familiar, Y-DNA follows the direct male line, while mtDNA follows the direct female line. This is particularly useful in genealogy because it doesn't get mixed up every generation like the rest of our DNA. By looking at these direct lines in the 500 soldiers, the researchers could see exactly which populations the mothers and fathers of these men came from. This is how they were able to identify the specific Sephardic and North African lines so clearly. They weren't just looking at percentages, they were looking at a direct, unbroken chain of physical history. The genealogy community is also using this data to solve cold cases of family history, mysteries that have been unsolved for 5 or 6 generations. With the reference data from these 500 soldiers, it's now possible to triangulate where a mystery ancestor might have actually come from, even if they changed their name and burned their records. We are entering an era of radical transparency in human history. The secrets of the past are being unlocked by the science of the present. What's truly stunning is how much of this was common knowledge in the small communities where these people lived, only to be lost when the younger generations moved to the cities. Old-timers used to talk about the dark-skinned families in the hollow or the folks who spoke a different language at home. Those stories were often dismissed as legends or myths. But the DNA proves that the legends were true. Those different families were a significant part of the fabric of the 19th century South. As the study continues, the researchers are finding more links to the Caribbean and Central America. They found soldiers whose DNA suggests they were part of the migrations from the Caribbean islands during the late 1700s, bringing with them a blend of French, Spanish, and African heritage. This adds yet another layer to the story. The Gulf Coast was a gateway to the entire Atlantic world, and the men who fought the war reflected that. They were part of a global network of trade, movement, and biology. For the viewers interested in DNA, this study is the ultimate proof of how powerful this tool can be. It's not just about a pie chart of percentages. It's about the narrative. It's about the ability to look at a 500-person sample size and see the movement of entire civilizations. It's about realizing that history is actually just the sum of millions of individual paths, and those paths are etched into our very being. The genealogy forums are currently abuzz with the possibility of a digital memorial. This would be a place where the DNA profiles of these soldiers, anonymized, of course, could be compared against the profiles of modern descendants. It would be a living family tree that spans centuries, connecting people through their shared biology rather than just their shared last names. It's a vision of the future where the past is never truly gone, because it's always present in our genetic code. As we look at the results of these 500 tests, we are forced to confront the fact that American history is much bigger than we were taught. It's a story of people who didn't fit into neat categories. It's a story of people who crossed boundaries, both physical and social, and it's a story that is still being written, one vial of DNA at a time. The 500 soldiers have given us a gift, the truth about where we come from and who we really are. The next time you look at an old photo from the 19th century or walk through an old cemetery, remember that there is more there than meets the eye. Behind every name and every date is a biological odyssey that spans thousands of years and thousands of miles. The DNA tests on those 500 soldiers were just the beginning. They opened the door, and now we are all walking through it together, into a history that is deeper, richer, and more diverse than we ever dared to imagine. The genealogy forums aren't just shocked. They are energized. They are on the hunt for the truth, armed with the latest technology and a new mindset. They know that the American story isn't a single line. It's a massive, tangled, beautiful web. And every time a new DNA test is processed, one more thread in that web is illuminated. The 500 soldiers have rewritten history, and in doing so, they have given every American a more honest way to look at their own past. Stay tuned as we continue to follow the developments of the Confederate DNA project. As the sample size grows and the technology improves, who knows what other secrets will be revealed? History is under the microscope, and the results are stunning. Whether you are a dedicated genealogist or just someone interested in the power of DNA, this is a story that belongs to you. It's the story of us, written in the code of life, and it's finally being told. The double helix has become the ultimate historian. It doesn't have an agenda, it doesn't have a bias, and it never forgets. Through the remains of 500 soldiers, it has spoken, and its message is clear. We are all more connected, more diverse, and more complex than we ever knew. And that, in itself, is a story worth telling. Keep searching, keep testing, and keep looking for the truth that lives inside you. The past is waiting to be discovered, one snip at a time.